Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar briefing on which we're discussing California's support for K-12 schools and how it compares. I'm Stephen Bliss, Director of Strategic Communications at the California Budget and Policy Center, and I'm joined by Jonathan Kaplan, Senior Policy Analyst at the Budget Center, for this briefing. This briefing follows the release of our fact sheet earlier this week, entitled "California's Support for K-12 Education Ranks Low by Almost Any Measure." And this fact sheet includes a new analysis of California's K-12 spending relative to other states, a question that we get asked about pretty frequently at the Budget Center. You don't need a copy of the fact sheet for this briefing. In fact, Jonathan will be going through one of the key charts from the fact sheet as part of this briefing and as part of the slides. But if you would like a copy, I'm happy to send one along to you. You can just email me directly at sbliss@calbudgetcenter.org, and I'll be happy to send you a copy of this fact sheet. So the way this briefing is going to go, it's only a 30-minute briefing, but we want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. So Jonathan's going to lead things off with a short overview and discussion of the analysis in the fact sheet, and then from there we're going to throw it open to questions from you all. And you'll see on your GoToWebinar console in the lower right, there's a question window where you can type in any questions, and as we get those via that window, we'll pass those along to Jonathan so we can address those via the webinar. So with that, I'm very happy to turn things over to Jonathan Kaplan, Senior Policy Analyst. Jonathan.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks everybody for taking the time to join us this afternoon. We really appreciate you calling in. I'm going to briefly run through some of the main findings in this report and then look forward to answering any questions you may have afterwards. I will also note that we published another report in August that examines different sources for spending information and explains why state rankings can vary depending on the source of information and how it's interpreted. So I encourage you to look at that report after today's call, as it provides useful information that can help clarify some of the questions that arise regarding comparisons of California school spending to other states. So as Stephen said, we are often asked how California compares to other states with regard to the support we provide to K-12 schools. The main finding in this report is that California's support for schools ranks low by any measure, or almost any measure, I should say. To provide up-to-date spending information, we analyzed National Education Association data, which is the only source available that allows for a comparison of 2014-15 school spending among all states. In addition, for the first time, we adjusted that 2014-15 spending information in this report for differences in the cost of living among states. This adjustment allows for a more meaningful comparison of different states' support for schools, because the dollars in states with higher cost of living, such as California, do not stretch as far as those in states with lower costs of living. So when we look at the table in this week's report, California spending per K-12 student, adjusted for those differences in states' cost of living, ranked 42nd among all states in 2014-15. California schools spent $10,140 per K-12 student, about $1,900 less than the nation as a whole. Now, another spending measure we encourage people to consider is school spending as a share of the economy. By looking at spending as a share of the personal income of each state's residents, one can take into account differences in states' wealth, and thus the capacity of each state to support its K-12 schools. Based on this measure, California ranked 36th among all states in 2014-15. Spending 3.48% of state personal income on K-12 schools compared to 3.88% in the nation as a whole. Now, when looking at staffing ratios, based on the most recent data available, California ranked last in the nation in the number of K-12 students per teacher, per guidance counselor, and per librarian. Moreover, the ratio of more than 7,500 California students per librarian, or 785 students per guidance counselor, demonstrates how stretched the state schools are when providing services to its students. Another consideration is when we rank California school spending relative to other states, we really understate what we should spend because these rankings do not take into account the particular needs of California students. For example, California schools enroll the largest share of English learners in the nation, and California's share of students from low-income families is greater than the share for the nation as a whole. So this all adds up to the need for greater investment in California schools. However, any discussion of increasing funding for California schools must be connected to a discussion of state revenue, as funding for California schools often depends on the level of those state revenues. For example, voter approval of Proposition 30 in 2012 increased taxes and state revenues, providing a significant increase in K-12 school spending in the past couple of years. Just 2 years ago, prior to the full impact of Proposition 30, California ranked even lower than we do today. In 2012-13, California ranked 50th in spending per K-12 student after adjusting for differences in states' cost of living. And we ranked 46th in spending as a percentage of personal income. In addition to an improving economy, the increase in revenues from Proposition 30 was clearly a factor in improving our spending rankings to where they are today. However, Prop 30's revenues are set to begin to expire at the end of next year and will decline after the 2015-16 budget year. This means unless California voters extend Proposition 30's tax increases or improve an alternative tax measure, the state schools will likely receive relatively fewer dollars in the years ahead. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Stephen and look forward to answering any questions you may have about the report.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I appreciate the presentation and your remarks that help unpack some of the key elements of the report. We're going to open it up now for questions from the audience. As I mentioned earlier, we wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, and you can use the question pane or question window in the GoToWebinar console that you should see on your screen to raise any questions you have about the implications of this fact sheet for the state budget or for California schools, or if you have any questions about data sources or anything else that you wanted to raise for Jonathan. So I'm going to give people a few minutes to chime in with any questions, but in the meantime, I wanted to just put a question to Jonathan as a way of getting into the data a little bit. So we often hear people talk about class sizes in California, either statewide or in their local schools, and the trends that they're seeing. So just a question about one of the data items in the table. Is the student to teacher ratio, is that reflective of average class size in California?
Thanks, Stephen. So oftentimes there's some confusion about the student to teacher ratio data point. In fact, it is not an average class size. When we look at the numbers of students per teacher in California, what we're looking at is the total number of students in the state and the total number of teachers in the state. And what that does not reflect is what an average class would look like in the state. It basically provides us a straight calculation of teachers per student. What this data point does point out is that we have, we're not just larger in terms of the numbers of students per teacher in this country. We're more than 40% higher than the national ratio. And so we have substantially more students per all staff in the country, and it is not just, not just as relates to teachers, it relates to many staff in our schools.
Thank you. As a reminder, and I see we have a couple questions coming in, there's a question pane on your console, and you can just type in a question. It'll come directly to us, and then we can have Jonathan address that via the audio on the webinar. So Jonathan, the first question from the audience is what are some of your recommendations for improving our funding for the public schools beyond just simply extending Prop 30?
Well, when we talk about overall funding for schools, what we're talking about in California is the Proposition 98 school funding guarantee. And so one of the factors that is clearly involved in that Prop 98 guarantee is Prop 30. The other thing is state revenues as a whole. So when we talk about how we can affect what's going on in terms of the overall funding level for the state, we want to have a robust and improving economy over time. That will ultimately be the biggest factor that improves funding for California schools. Aside from that, you know, there can be more discussions about how to improve revenues for the state. One would argue that you know, we need to think about the revenue picture in the state of California, because even with an improving economy, we still rank relatively low compared to other states in this country. So there's certainly more room in the picture here for increasing revenues. That is also pointed to by the data in the spending as a percentage of personal income in this table. So when we talk about the overall personal income of people in this state, what we see is that we rank still relatively low comparative to other states, and we have plenty of room to be gaining from the income of the state's residents to be improving the revenue picture for the state of California, and that would help improve funding for schools.
One of the things that's a key takeaway from the fact sheet is this idea that you know, the sort of gap between California K-12 spending and the rest of the country. Is there a way to sort of quantify not just the sort of you know, how far we are behind sort of per student, but just sort of what the overall size of that gap is? In other words, how much more would we need to be investing as a state to even bring ourselves up to where the rest of the country is?
Sure. So when we look at the overall amount of dollars that it would take for California to reach the level of spending in the United States as a whole, what we see is on a per student basis, California would have had to spend in 2014-15, last year, $13 billion more to reach the exact same level as the rest of the, as the nation as a whole. To frame that as the amount of how much of an increase that would be relative to the amount we spent in 14-15, that would be about an 18% increase in spending on K-12 schools. When we look at that same factor, when we're looking at how much we would have had to spend as a share of personal income or as a share of the size of the state's economy, California would have had to spend about $8 billion more to reach the total spending as a share of the economy that the rest of the U.S. spent, and that would equate to about an 11.5% increase relative to what we spent last year.
Thank you. We have another question now that came in via the question window, which is, since the implementation of the local control funding formula, which most people on this call know is California's new, relatively new K-12 funding formula, has funding improved in California's public schools? And maybe in answering that, maybe the the sort of broader question is sort of what LCFF has meant for school funding in California more generally as well. Jonathan.
Sure. So yes, since the state implemented a new funding formula, that is not the amount of dollars that schools receive, but the allocation of those dollars through this new state law in 2013 called the Local Control Funding Formula. And since 2013, there have been significant increases in funding for California schools. That then has, to give a frame of reference, we're funding California schools at about $47.8 billion in the Prop 98 guarantee in 11-12. That's prior to the implementation of LCFF. And in the 2015-16 year, we're increasing to about $69.1 billion. That's more than a $20 billion increase in the 98 guarantee. So there's been significant increases in funding since the statute, the local control funding formula, was implemented. And that implementation also, importantly, allocates dollars to school districts based on the demographics of each school district. So every school district receives dollars that are based on the grade level of the student in a school district, as well as the whether that a student in that grade level is disadvantaged as either being a student from a low-income family, a student who is an English learner, or a foster youth. So those categories of students receive greater funding under the formula. And there has been an increase in that funding since the implementation of the law a few years ago.
Thanks, Jonathan. We're starting to get a couple more questions from the audience, so thanks for those and keep them coming. Next question has to do with revenue volatility in general in California. And the question is, in most states, school spending rests on a relatively stable source, the property tax. California taxes are highly volatile. This is from the questioner. Volatility creates serious budget planning for schools. It's not just the total amount, it's the ability to plan over several years. What is your analysis, and I think that's taken to mean not just this fact sheet, but our broader analyses say about stability? So Jonathan, the question is about volatility in revenues and what that means for school funding and how to address it.
Well, clearly there are challenges relative to the state's revenue structure that is pointed by the questioner in terms of the ups and downs of funding and the planning possibility, the implications for planning of a school district. So as we saw between 2007-8 and 2008-9, when we had a very large drop in state revenue, this had an impact on, needless to say, not only schools but of the rest of the state in terms of figuring out how to handle such a decline. Now, I think some of what is implied by the question is the issue of depending on a revenue stream that is relatively volatile may have implications for school districts, but we must also ask ourselves, what is the other option we have for raising revenue for schools, if not from gaining revenue from personal income taxes or from capital gains taxes, as an example, which are typically the question that has to do with whether or not those revenue streams are problematic. I don't know whether or not we would have another option for ourselves to see a revenue stream that would grow over time. And what we know is that when we look backwards and we look at revenue streams over the last 20 or 30 years, we have consistent growth in revenue from personal income taxes, and so if we replaced that with another tax or another revenue stream, we would need to ask ourselves whether we would have that same growth over time. But I don't have an answer to say that there is the best revenue source. All I know is that the revenue source that we have is one that is growing over time, which is a good thing.
So just as a reminder, we have a couple other questions coming in from the audience, but just as a reminder, just if you want to pose a question to Jonathan, just use the question pane on the GoToWebinar console. You just type in the question, then it'll go to Jonathan to answer on the webinar. So the next question gets back to the question of rankings and where we stand, Jonathan. And the question is, and from the audience is, where does California rank without the cost of living adjustment? That is, without the adjustment to reflect different states' costs of living. And the question goes on to say, it seems like it would still be quite low. That is to say, our ranking without the cost adjustment. Where do we stand there, Jonathan?
Yeah, so based on the same set of data, that would be 2014-15 spending that's reported by the National Education Association, which is the only source that we have that can make comparisons among states for the 2014-15 year, the most current information we have available. We did that crunch and reported it back in March, and we rank 29th in the nation when we do not adjust for those cost differences among states. So even when we compare California to Alabama or Mississippi, or we compare ourselves to any other state in the nation that may have significantly lower costs for providing education, California still ranks quite low, or relatively low, despite the fact that it wouldn't be a true apples-to-apples comparison if we weren't adjusting for those cost differences among states.
Thank you, Jonathan. And to come back to the question of LCFF, or the new funding formula, for a moment, you talked a little bit about the impact of LCFF on school spending, but Can you say, you've also talked in terms of revenues about the importance of sort of sustained growth in revenues over time. Could you talk a little bit about how, sort of what local control funding formula implementation, how that connects with sort of the state revenues, sort of what, how an overall revenue level for the state is connected to implementation of the local control funding formula?
Right. So one of the things about the local control funding formula that isn't necessarily broadly understood is that it establishes targets for school funding for every school district in the state. And we have yet to reach those targets in most school districts in this state. So it sets a target, and then we are basically funding school districts to reach those targets over time. And we, according to the Legislative Analyst Office most recent report, we are at about 90% of funding of those targets in the 15-16 year. And we would, even with a scenario where we would continue economic growth according to the LAO's recent fiscal outlook, in 2019-20, we would only get to a 96% funding of those targets in the 2019-20 year. Now, what that also doesn't take into account is whether we would, one, hit a recession between now and 2019-20, or whether we would increase funding by extending Proposition 30's tax increases in that time period. And so we are close. What LCFF and the new funding formula requires is that the state provides dollars to school districts according to the formula, and that would help us reach a target that is established by the formula, but we're still not there yet, and only by increasing funding for school districts over time will we reach those targets. Ultimately, the technical way of looking at it is if we increase funding by through the Prop 98 guarantee by greater than the cost of living adjustments that are given to school districts, that is the way that we would actually get to reach those targets over time.
Thank you. We're going to leave a couple more minutes for questions to come in from the audience. We're scheduled to go for a few more minutes, and so again, if you have any final questions for Jonathan, I want to give you another minute or so to type those in to the question pane on your console. We've had great questions so far, and we appreciate those. Jonathan, as we move toward closing, I just wanted to, just because we did have a number of people who were kind of joining as the webinar was underway, just to, if you could, just for those joining late, just kind of circle back to that kind of the top level takeaway in terms of where we stand in the ranking using the cost adjustment, that 42nd ranking that you noted earlier, and sort of why that's significant and new as a data point.
Right, and so what hasn't been done previously is to use the most recent spending data which we have that you can compare among states. That's K-12 spending data, and that it comes from the 2014-15 year. And when we look at that year's data and we adjust it for regional cost differences or cost differences among states, when we do that cost adjustment to make an apples-to-apples comparison between California and other states in the country, California ranks 42nd in per-pupil spending, spending roughly $1,900 less than the U.S. as a whole. So we are basically reporting out that while California has improved that ranking over the last few years, we still rank relatively low compared to the rest of the nation when we make cost adjustments based on the costs of different states.
Great, thanks. And with that, a couple other questions that I wanted to make sure we got in from the audience. You mentioned earlier, this is a question from the audience. You mentioned roughly $13 billion as the overall size of the gap. And the question is, does that amount include estimated needs for school facilities?
Good question. No, it does not. None of these numbers actually reflect anything with regard to capital outlay. So when we're looking at spending, and we're looking at spending per student, all we're looking at is a technical term called current expenditure, which excludes capital outlay, that's spending on facilities. It also excludes other portions of school spending that are not considered to be that have great variance one year to the next depending on a school district or on a state. So what we're trying to do is to take out issues that would cause problems in the data and look more specifically at what's really going on in terms of the day-to-day operations of a school, as opposed to how much it costs to build a school building or the debt associated to that facility.
And then a related question, this is actually one that had come into me via email, so sort of outside of GoToWebinar, is on a related note, in terms of some of the increased pension obligations of school districts, how do the figures that we're presenting in this analysis, how do these dollars kind of relate to those pension obligations?
Right, and so the state retirement system for teachers, or CalSTRS, there has been a change in state law in terms of the amount that is provided to fund CalSTRS over the course of the next several years, and there are increased obligations under that change in state law for school districts to provide funding for the CalSTRS system. These figures that I'm pointing to in this report basically are not necessarily looking at how much it would cost for a school district to provide an education, but rather how much schools are spending, and so those increased pressures will definitely have an impact on what's going on in schools across the state. I will say that the state's teacher retirement system is a key part of attracting and maintaining a high-quality workforce in the state of California. And we are hearing recently, for example, about the potential for a teacher shortage that seems to be in the news recently, and in the coming years. And I would argue maintaining the solvency of the state's teacher retirement system will help in our efforts to attract teachers to the profession. So I think oftentimes, the question about teacher pensions or otherwise is not taking into account that we hopefully are attracting and sustaining a quality workforce, and CalSTRS is definitely a piece of that picture.
Thank you. And another question from the audience related to the prospects of extending Prop 30 or offering some alternatives to Prop 30 going forward. And the question is, what organizations or groups are pushing for specific funding proposals to improve the funding of California's public schools?
Well, there are at least two proposals that are with the Attorney General's office, as I understand, to extend Proposition 30. There are some differences in those two proposals. We have not yet analyzed them in great depth, but both of them would help in the sense that they would both extend the current tax increases that exist beyond their expiration in 2016, and would help ultimately provide this level of, help increase state revenue relative to where state revenue would be without Proposition 30. In terms of who's pushing them, I wouldn't. I don't know exactly who's pushing all of these different proposals, but I am, we'll have to wait and see clearly whether or not one of them emerges or more than one that voters will have to take a look at next fall in terms of trying to provide the level of funding that we would hope to have for schools moving forward.
Thank you, and we're right up against the 2:30 time, and so I think we'll leave it on that sort of forward-looking note. And with that, I'll also just remind you that in the coming weeks and months, we'll be continuing to offer commentary and analysis not just on K-12 school spending, but on other key issues related to the state budget and related policies. And so I encourage you to keep up with all the latest on our website, including the commentary on our blog on our website at calbudgetcenter.org, which you see on the screen. You can also follow us on Facebook. We're very active as well on Twitter, and you see the Twitter handle up there on the screen as well, at Cal Budget Center. And of course, if there's anything that we can do, if you want any additional information, feel free to reach out to us directly via email, contact at calbudgetcenter.org. That'll get to me and Jonathan if it has to do with this webinar. And so with that, I just want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. We had great turnout for the webinar, and I appreciate the interest. And also thank you Jonathan for the presentation and for addressing the questions. So with that, we'll wish you all a good afternoon, and we'll talk to you soon.